welcome to the Moose Podcast. Today, a history special. Which empire had the biggest long-term impact on Africa? Now, before we start, we need to talk about the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa was the occupation and division and colonization of African territory by Western European powers, including Britain, France and Belgium, during the period of new imperialism between 1881 and 1914. In 1870, only 10% of Africa was under formal European control, and by 1914, it had increased to almost 90% of the continent. So, before we go on further, we need to talk about the Berlin Conference. So the Berlin Conference was in 1884. Now this regulated European colonization and trade in Asia. It is usually referred to as the ultimate point of the Scramble for Africa. Consequent to the political and economic rivalries among the European empires in the last quarter of the 19th century, splitting up of Africa was how the Europeans avoided warring amongst themselves over Africa. The later years of the 19th century saw the transition from informal imperialism by military influence and economic dominance to direct rule, bringing about colonial. So, our topic is which empire had the biggest long-term impact on Africa. So we need to talk about the long-term. So how can we define which empire had the biggest long-term impact on Africa? So, just before we start, I need to set a few guidelines. So, I'm not saying necessarily that an impact has to be good or bad, and also an impact doesn't necessarily have to only affect the African countries, but can also affect the rest of the population. So today with us we have three special guests. We have Alexi Aber, historian on British colonialism. We have Hassan Al-Halabi, specialist on Belgian colonialism.
Assalamu alaikum.
And Elliot Kopelu, historian on French colonialism.
Hello there.
So, Elliot, would you like to start? So, would you just like to tell us why you believe that France had the biggest long-term impact on Africa? Thank you.
Yes, okay. So, I believe that France had the biggest long-term Africa based on the economic crisis in some countries. Sudan, which was a big country for cotton, and those cotton plantations were built by the French in around 1890. Once those countries had been able to sell the cotton, they had increased their economic status, but after a few years in about early 2000s, their cotton trade went down quite dramatically, and the economic crisis just started, and it's still going on today.
So are you saying that France's biggest long-term impact on Africa was actually that it ruined the economy?
No. I'm saying that it was the reason for why it grew an economy, but for some reason, I would tell you that in another podcast, but they ruined their economic status. Also, 31 countries in Africa speak French, and French is the most frequent language spoken in Africa. The French were able to make profit, which gave the Africans a lot of money, especially in the western part, because the French had a lot of trading centers in the western part, which helped increase trade with other African countries and European powers. Yes, that is why. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that long spiel. Alexi, why do you believe that Africa had the biggest long-term impact on Africa? The Britain had the...
I'm sorry about that.
You should be. Also, may I add that India has lots of British culture in it, including cricket. So, Hassan, just before you start, I just want to ask a question to all of you. So, who do you think gained the most economically, and who do you think was the worst in terms of empire? Hassan.
May I start? So, I would say the worst country who gained no money or power was Belgium, because they ruined the current economic status of the Congo, Rwanda and Burundi. And may I also add to Elliot Kopalumayu's point that these three countries may speak French, but it wasn't from the French people, it was from the Belgian people.
Excuse me, that is absolutely false.
The Belgians speak Flemish.
That is false.
No, you
Okay.
can search it up.
That is false.
I proved my point.
Okay, let's
Okay,
move
you
on.
may be a specialist in Belgium colonies, okay? But get your facts straight, okay? That is wrong.
Yes. I know that both the French and the English really improved Africa's status, like more specifically the country that they colonized. But Belgium didn't improve it. It made it worse. They have the most negative long-term impacts, because when King Leopold II came into power in 1865, he thought it would have been a good idea to slaughter 8 million Africans, which was the half of the population of the Congo. And his greedy activities led to the poor economy in Rwanda, Burundi, and the Republic of the Congo.
Thank you.
And I rest my
So,
case.
just before we conclude, I'd like to ask you all a question. So, do you believe that your minds have been swayed? And if so, who do you think has which colonial empire has the most important long-term impact on Africa?
Sure, absolutely. I definitely think that Belgium is not one of those, and I think that France and the British Empire definitely had the biggest impact, especially economic wise. Okay, if that is to your liking, I still believe that France had the biggest impact on Africa. What about you, Alexei? What is your opinion?
Alright, thank you. Hassan, would you like to finish us off, please?
So one thing that I want to add on Belgium is that it gained absolutely nothing. It was
I think we can all conclude that Belgium did nothing.
So,
It was rubbish.
I would agree with you that it was trash, because the Congo Free State, which was the name of the Congo a long time ago, evolved from a vanity possession of King Leopold into a slave population, because the king would send the soldiers and all the Congolese population into the jungle to get rubber. It would be attached to their skins, and they would have to rip it off slowly and slowly until they
graphic.
suffered severe injuries.
How graphic? So we're so I'd like to thank all of you guys for participating into our podcast.
Thank you, Raphael, for having us on this
before we go,
lovely podcast.
Make sure to follow Moose Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, WhatsApp, and Facebook. You can find us on moosepodcast.com. Peace out. Moose.